When you spend enough years in the void, you learn to read darkness the way a pilot reads instrument panels. You catalog its textures, the clean black of a powered-down section versus the grainy dark of failing luminators, versus the wet dark that appears when something is wrong with the atmospheric recyclers. But what do you do when darkness stops being the absence of light and becomes something that watches back? The Adeptus Mechanicus keeps sealed records of void ships that went silent in the halo stars, their distress beacons still transmitting, their life support still functioning, their crews simply gone. Most assume these are standard losses to warp predation or Xenos raids. Some know better. There are things in the galaxy that don't invade ships or board them through breach points. They were already there, waiting in the spaces between the lumens, patient as rust. My name is Thaddeus Crine. I served as a void rating 3rd class aboard the cargo hauler Midnight Covenant for 8 standard years before our encounter with the Umbra. Of the 7 souls aboard when we entered the Ghoul Star's shipping corridor, 3 survived long enough to reach the emergency capsules. I am the only one who made it to an Imperial listening post. What follows is not speculation or folklore. It is documentation of how something that barely exists can systematically erase a crew that thinks light will save them. The Midnight Covenant operated on a standard tithe run between Forge World Metallica and the agri-combines of the Ghoul Star's periphery. Ours was not glamorous work. We hauled processed fertilizers outbound and raw minerals return. The ship was old, 6,000 years of continuous operation with components replaced so many times that our tech priest, Magos Ven, claimed no original material remained except the blessed keel plate. We expected mechanical failures, the way groundsiders expect weather. But there are patterns to how machines degrade, and this was wrong from the beginning. It started in Subhold 16, a storage vault we used for surplus parts and damaged equipment awaiting repair. The lumen-strips in that section began cycling without input, brightening to their maximum output for exactly 17 seconds, then shutting down completely. Not dimming. Full darkness. Then the cycle would repeat. Engansir Kyle reported it as a simple power regulation fault and dispatched a repair team. Void ratings. Harrow and Chess went in with standard toolkits and a portable generator. They returned 6 hours later, both pale and unwilling to meet anyone's eyes directly. The lumen strips, they reported, were functioning perfectly. Power flow was stable. The relays showed no stress. The machine spirits were content. Yet the cycling continued, bright then dark, bright then dark, with mechanical precision. Kyle ordered the section sealed and logged the incident as an unexplained phenomena. Pending Mechanicus review, we should have recognized this for what it was. Not a malfunction. An invitation. 3 days passed without incident. The sealed bulkhead to Subhold 16 displayed no abnormal readings. Internal atmospheric pressure remained stable. Temperature held at standard. The lumen cycling continued on its 17-second rhythm, visible through the observation port as a regular pulse of light and shadow. Some of the crew began making jokes about it, calling it the ship's heartbeat, claiming they could time their work shifts by its regularity. Humor is how void crews process unease. We were uneasy, though none of us would have admitted it. On the 4th day, Rating Marsh failed to report for his shift. His bunk in the crew quarters showed signs of recent use, blanket thrown back, but no indication of where he had gone. This was unusual, but not unprecedented. Men sometimes needed time alone on long voyages, found empty cargo bays or observation blisters where they could sit in silence. We logged him as absent and assigned his duties to others. When he missed a second shift, Master-at-Arms Kelvin began a formal search. They found Marsh in subhold 12, 2 sections away from the sealed area. He was alive, technically, but unresponsive. His eyes were open and tracking movement, but he would not speak, would not acknowledge questions, would not respond to physical contact. The ship's medici, a woman named Sora, who had trained in the Schola Medici on Meridian, could find nothing physiologically wrong. His vitals were normal. His pupils reacted to light. His reflexes functioned. But he would not, or could not, communicate. Sora sedated him and confined him to the medical bay. She noted in her log that his eyes, even under sedation, continued to move. Not randomly, but as if following something that circled his bed, just beyond the range of the overhead lumen. I read that log later, after. At the time, we simply accepted her assessment that Marsh had suffered some form of psychological break. Void madness was rare, but documented. Sometimes the isolation got to people. The pattern should have been obvious then. First, the lights began acting according to rules we didn't set. Then a crew member was taken, not physically, but mentally. Something was testing our responses, learning how we would react. We assumed we were dealing with mechanical and medical problems. We were actually being studied. 5 days after Marsh's collapse, I was assigned to maintenance duty in the forward observation blister. This was a small chamber, perhaps 4 meters in diameter, with a reinforced viewport that allowed visual confirmation of navigational hazards during real space transit. We were between systems, moving through the empty void between stars, so there was nothing to observe except the distant pinpricks of light and the occasional shimmer of stellar dust. I was checking the integrity of the viewport seals, a routine task that required me to examine each segment of the seal line for cracks or degradation. The work was meditative, requiring attention, but not thought. My hand lumen cast a tight beam as I traced the seals. Behind me, the chamber's main lumens provided standard illumination. I had been working for perhaps 20 minutes when I noticed the shadow on the curved wall opposite the viewport. It was my shadow, cast by the main lumens, but it was wrong. I was crouched near the viewport, bent at an angle to reach the lower seals. My shadow should have been a compressed shape, foreshortened by the angle of the light. Instead, it stood upright, fully extended, and it was not mimicking my movements. I froze. My shadow continued to move. It raised one arm, slowly, as if reaching for something above its head. I felt my pulse accelerate, felt the particular cold that comes not from temperature, but from the body's recognition that something fundamental has broken. I did not move. My shadow reached higher, fingers splayed. Then it turned its head, still stretched tall and impossible, and appeared to look directly at where I crouched. I spun, hand lumen sweeping the chamber. The main lumens were functioning. There was nothing else in the observation blister. I was alone. When I looked back at the wall, my shadow was correctly positioned again, properly compressed, mimicking my posture exactly. I remained still for a full minute, watching. The shadow did not repeat its behavior. I should have reported this immediately. I told myself I was tired, that the confined space and isolation had created an optical illusion, that my eyes had misinterpreted the geometry. These were lies I offered myself because the alternative was unacceptable. The alternative was that something had used my shadow as a way to announce its presence. That would have meant I was being watched by something that could manipulate the most basic physical phenomena. I chose the comfortable lie and continued my work. That night, I lay in my bunk and stared at the ceiling. The crew quarters were kept dim during sleep cycles, only emergency lumens active. I could see my bunkmates in their racks, the rise and fall of their breathing. I could see the shadows those emergency lumens cast, the familiar angles and shapes of a space I had occupied for years. None of those shadows moved independently, but I remained awake, watching, until the shift change alarm pulled us all back to duty. Over the next week, 7 more crew members reported anomalous shadow behavior. Each account was different in detail, but identical in structure. Rating Voss saw his shadow stretch across 3 bulkheads while working in the engine compartment, elongating far beyond what the light source could justify. Loader Crane watched her shadow split into 3 separate silhouettes during inventory duty, each moving independently. Enginseer Kael's shadow developed additional limbs, spider-like extensions that crawled across the ceiling while he remained stationary at his workstation. In each case, the witness was alone. In each case, the behavior lasted only seconds before the shadow returned to normal. And in each case, the witness initially chose not to report the incident, only coming forward after learning that others had experienced similar phenomena. We were following the universal pattern of people who encounter things that should not exist. We individually doubted our own perceptions before we collectively acknowledged the pattern. Magos Ven convened a senior staff meeting in the bridge command chamber. Present were Captain Helmar, Master-at-Arms Kelvin, Medicae Sora, Chief Enginseer Kael, and myself, representing the Void raiding crews. Ven's augmetic voice carried no emotion as he presented the data. 17 separate incidents over 9 days. No physical evidence. No atmospheric contamination. No warp corruption detectable by the ship's limited sensors. No mechanical explanation for the lumen behavior in Subhold 16, which continued its regular cycle undisturbed. Captain Helmar was a Void officer of the old tradition, 40 years in the Merchant Marine, chosen for reliability rather than imagination. He listened to Ven's presentation with visible skepticism. When the Magos finished, Helmar spoke with the clipped precision of someone who has decided the answer before hearing the question. Mass hallucination brought on by extended void exposure and poor air quality. Increase oxygen supplementation across all crew sections. Assign psychological counseling sessions for affected personnel. Maintain current course and operations. He did not ask for discussion. The meeting was dismissed. I remained behind after the others filed out, waiting until only Ven and I occupied the chamber. The Magos regarded me with his remaining biological eye, the other having been replaced with a superior optical augmentation that reflected the bridge lumens with insect-like precision. "You have a concern," rating Crine. His statement, not a question. I described what I had witnessed in the observation blister, providing exact details of the shadow's movement, its deviation from physical law. Ven listened without interruption. When I finished, he was silent for 7 seconds. Physical shadows cannot act independently of their casting objects. This is fundamental to light propagation physics. Yet 16 crew members have now reported precisely this phenomenon. We face 2 possibilities. First, we are experiencing collective neurological dysfunction. Second, we are experiencing an encounter with an entity that manipulates electromagnetic radiation in ways inconsistent with understood physics. He paused. The Omnissiah's logic demands we test which is true before we proceed. How would we test that? I asked. We establish a controlled observation environment and wait to see if the phenomenon repeats under documented conditions. Ven's augmetic fingers tapped against his data slate. I will requisition Hold 23 for this purpose. It will be sealed, monitored, and equipped with multiple independent recording devices. If shadow behavior occurs, we will have objective documentation. If it does not, we will have confirmation of neurological causes. I volunteered to be the test subject. Ven agreed. Hold 23 was a mid-sized storage compartment, approximately 10 meters by 12, normally used for sealed container storage. Ven had it emptied and equipped with 3 separate pict capture units positioned at different angles, each recording continuously to independent storage banks. The chamber had a single entrance, sealed by a standard pressure door with an observation port. 6 lumen-strips provided illumination, their power flow monitored by dedicated sensors. I would enter, remain for 2 hours, and perform standard maintenance tasks to simulate normal working conditions. Ven, Kael, and Kelvin would observe from outside through the port and via the pict feeds. If anomalous shadow behavior occurred, we would have documentation from multiple sources that could be analyzed for evidence of either objective phenomena or subjective perception failure. I entered hold 23 at 800 hours, ship standard time. The door sealed behind me with the familiar hiss of equalizing pressure. The lumen strips provided even white illumination. My shadow appeared on the deck plating, properly proportioned, correctly positioned relative to the overhead lights. I carried a standard maintenance kit and a set of tasks. Check each lumen strip connection point for corrosion. Examine the atmospheric vent covers for seal integrity. Inspect the deck plating for stress fractures. Routine work that would keep me moving throughout the chamber. For the first 40 minutes, nothing unusual occurred. I worked methodically, documenting each inspection point on a data slate, aware of the pict capture units recording my every movement. My shadow behaved exactly as physics demanded, stretching and compressing according to my position relative to the lumen strips. Through the observation port, I could see Ven's silhouette, motionless, watching. At 43 minutes, the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, perhaps 2 degrees. But the change was sudden, without the gradual shift that would indicate a failing climate control unit. I noted this on my data slate and continued working. 45 minutes, I noticed that my shadow had become darker. Not larger or misshapen, but more defined, as if the contrast between shadow and illuminated deck had increased. I knelt and examined the lumen strips directly. They were burning at standard output. Yet my shadow had somehow deepened. At 47 minutes, a second shadow appeared. It emerged from beneath a storage rack along the starboard wall, sliding across the deck like oil spreading on water. It was not attached to any object. It had no source. It simply existed. A patch of darkness roughly human-shaped, moving with deliberate purpose toward my own shadow. I remained frozen, watching as the independent shadow approached. When it reached the edge of my shadow, it stopped. Then it reached out, a pseudopod of darkness extending from its mass, and touched the shadow my body cast. I felt it. Not physically, not on my skin, but deeper. A sensation like cold water being poured into my chest cavity. Like something was reading the spaces between my organs. The independent shadow was not touching me. It was touching my shadow. And through that connection, it was accessing something fundamental to my existence. I stumbled backward, breaking the connection. The independent shadow remained where it was, a pool of darkness on the deck plating. I looked toward the observation port. Ven and the others were gesturing frantically, but I could not hear them through the sealed door. I activated my vox bead. "Did you see that? Did the pit captures record it?" Ven's synthesized voice came through with unusual urgency. "We see you standing in the center of the chamber. The pit captures show the same. There is no secondary shadow visible on any recording." I looked down. The independent shadow was still there, now beginning to move again, sliding toward me with increasing speed. I backed against the bulkhead, but there was nowhere to go in the sealed chamber. The shadow flowed across the deck, up the wall, and spread across the surface next to where I pressed myself flat. Then it did something I still cannot adequately describe. It opened, not like a door or a hatch. It opened the way a wound opens, or the way space itself might tear, if you could see dimensions humans are not meant to perceive. The shadow became a gap, a nothing, an absence so complete that looking into it felt like being pulled forward by suction. Inside that gap, I saw movement. Shapes that were not quite shapes, arrangements of geometry that hurt to observe. And beyond those shapes, I saw other places, other sections of the ship, all cast in the same deep shadow, all empty of crew, but full of these independent darknesses that crawled along every surface. I was seeing the Midnight Covenant as the Umbra saw it, a ship built from shadows and the spaces between light, where every illuminated corridor was just a bright interruption in their true domain. The shadow closed. I was standing against the bulkhead, gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The independent shadow was gone. My own shadow appeared normal. I looked at the observation port. Ven was cycling the door release. When I stumbled out into the corridor, Kyle grabbed my arm to steady me. I was shaking, I realized. My hands were trembling badly enough that I could not operate my data slate. "What did you experience?" Ven asked, his augmetic eye adjusting its focus to examine my face. I told them everything. The temperature drop, the darkening of my own shadow, the appearance of the independent shadow, the sensation of connection, the opening. I described the shapes I had seen, the glimpses of other ship sections filled with shadow entities. When I finished, none of them spoke immediately. Finally, Kyle voiced what we were all thinking. The pit captures showed none of it. We watched through the port and saw none of it. Either you experienced a complete break from reality, or these things exist in a way that standard observation cannot detect. There is a third option, Ven said quietly. They exist, but they choose what is seen and what is not. If they can manipulate electromagnetic radiation at will, they could selectively prevent their appearance on recording media while remaining visible to biological observation. He turned his full attention to me. You said you saw other sections of the ship through the opening. Which sections? I pulled up a ship schematic on the nearest data terminal and marked the areas I had glimpsed. Subholds 12, 16, and 19. The forward observation blister, the portside crew quarters, the main cargo bay, each one a location where crew members had reported shadow phenomena. We need to physically check these sections immediately, Kelvin said. If there's something actually present, something that's been hiding in our blind spots. We never completed that sentence. At that moment, every lumen on the ship went dark. The emergency lumens should have activated within 3 seconds of main power loss. That is standard Imperial Navy safety protocol, built into every void ship's design. 3 seconds passed in absolute darkness. Then 4. Then The backup systems were not engaging. Vox beads activated across the ship, crew members calling out their locations, asking for status reports. Captain Helmar's voice cut through the confusion, steady and command-focused. All personnel, remain at your current positions. Engineering, report on power failure. Bridge, initiate emergency lighting protocols manually. I stood in the corridor outside Hold 23, unable to see my hand in front of my face. The darkness was so complete that my eyes began generating phantom lights, neural misfires, in the absence of any actual input. Beside me, I could hear Ven's breathing, mechanical and rhythmic. Further down the corridor, other crew members were beginning to move, hands outstretched, feeling for bulkheads and handrails. Then I heard the screaming. It came from forward, somewhere in the crew quarters section. A man's voice, raw with terror, shouting words I could not distinguish at that distance. The scream cut off abruptly, replaced by a wet sound that I recognized from battlefield pict captures I had seen during training. The sound of flesh separating. Emergency lumens flickered on throughout the ship. The dim red lighting revealed a corridor full of crew members, frozen, looking toward the source of the scream. Kelvin was already moving, drawing his shock maul and running toward the crew quarters. Several ratings followed him, myself included. We found Rating Vance in the sleeping section. His body was lying across 3 separate bunks. I use the word across deliberately. He had been pulled apart, his torso torn from his legs, his arms removed at the shoulders. There was blood, but not as much as there should have been. Most of his body mass was simply gone, as if something had consumed the parts it separated. The emergency lumens cast everything in red shadows. On the bulkhead above Vance's remains, those shadows were moving, not cast by anything in the room, moving independently, writhing like living things, patterns that suggested limbs and faces and geometries I could not name. Kelvin raised his shock maul, though what he intended to strike I could not guess. Before he could move, the emergency lumens went dark again. In the absolute black, I heard movement, not footsteps or mechanical sounds, something that whispered across the metal deck plates, friction that should not exist. And I heard breathing that was not human, a sound like air being pulled through wet cloth. Someone triggered a hand lumen. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the sleeping section. The shadows on the bulkhead were gone. So were 2 of the crew members who had entered behind us. Ratings. Thorne and Kess had simply vanished in the seconds of darkness. "Get everyone to the bridge," Kelvin ordered, his voice tight with suppressed panic. "No one moves alone. No one separates. We stay in light, and we stay together." We retreated from the crew quarters, moving as a group down the central corridor toward the bridge. The emergency lumens remained active now, though they flickered irregularly. Each flicker made us freeze, weapons and tools raised, waiting to see if the darkness would bring another attack. We made it to the bridge without further incident. Captain Helmar was attempting to raise engineering on the Vox, but receiving only static. Ven went immediately to the sensor station, his augmetic fingers moving rapidly across the controls. He studied the readouts for several seconds before speaking. Life sign detection is showing significant discrepancies. We should have 127 registered biosigns aboard. I am reading 94. In less than 30 minutes, we had lost more than 30 crew members. Either they were dead and removed so thoroughly that no remains existed, or they had been taken to somewhere the ship's sensors could not detect. Given what I had seen through the shadows opening, I suspected the latter. The bridge's main lumens were functioning, providing strong illumination. I felt marginally safer there, though I understood this was likely an illusion. If the Umbra could extinguish every light on the ship simultaneously, no amount of illumination would truly protect us. They were choosing to allow us these islands of brightness, letting us cluster in lit spaces while they methodically claimed the dark sections. Magos Ven addressed the assembled crew, perhaps 40 of us now crammed into the bridge and adjoining command spaces. His synthesized voice carried across the crowd. "We are experiencing an attack by non-physical entities that exist in or manipulate darkness. They are invisible to standard detection, but capable of affecting physical matter. Standard defensive measures are ineffective. Our only demonstrated defense is illumination. which they have shown they can overcome by disabling our lighting systems. He paused. I am open to suggestions. The silence that followed was heavy with the recognition that we had no answers. These were void ratings and engine seers, soldiers and technicians. We were trained to handle mechanical failures, hull breaches, boarding actions. We were not equipped to fight shadows that ate the crew when the lights failed. Can we make it to the emergency capsules? Someone asked. Eject and hope for retrieval? The capsules are located in sections that are now without power, Helmar replied. Reaching them would require traveling through complete darkness for approximately 400 meters. Based on what we have witnessed, I assess the likelihood of survival as minimal. Then we restore power, Kelvin said. Engineering must have auxiliary generators. We send a team with maximum portable illumination, reactivate the power systems, and restore full lighting across the ship. Ven manipulated his data slate, pulling up schematics. Engineering is 7 sections aft. The route passes through cargo holds and maintenance corridors, many of which have limited lighting even under normal conditions. With main power compromised, those sections are likely completely dark. So we bring our own light, I said. Every hand lumen, every work lamp, every piece of equipment that generates illumination. We move as a group. We light the way. We make it impossible for these things to approach. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only plan we had. Helmar gave the order. Every crew member with portable lighting was to assemble in the main corridor. We would move together toward engineering, maintaining maximum illumination, and restore power to the ship's primary systems. 23 of us formed the expedition. We carried hand lumens, work lamps, emergency beacons, even a cutting torch that someone claimed would produce enough light to work as a weapon if necessary. We looked like a pilgrimage of light bearers, ridiculous and desperate in equal measure. As we left the bridge, I glanced back at the life sign sensors. The count had dropped to 89. The first 3 sections were still partially lit by emergency lumens, and we made good progress. We moved in a tight formation, lights overlapping to eliminate any shadows. The walls around us were standard Imperial construction, bare metal with occasional devotional script and technical markings. Nothing appeared unusual until we reached the first completely dark section. The bulkhead separating Section 4 from Section 5 had no power at all. The door was open, and beyond it lay absolute black. Our lights could penetrate perhaps 10 meters before the darkness simply absorbed the beams, as if the illumination was being consumed rather than reflected. We stopped at the threshold. Stay close, Kelvin ordered. Lights forward and to the sides. If anyone feels anything, sees anything, you shout immediately. We entered the dark section. Our combined illumination created a bubble of light around us, but that bubble felt fragile, insufficient. The darkness beyond our lights was not empty black. It had texture. It moved. I could see it at the edges of our light, withdrawing slightly as we advanced, but following us, keeping pace. We had gone perhaps 20 meters when the first person vanished. Rating Gorman was at the edge of our formation. His hand lumen pointed toward the port side bulkhead. One moment he was there, light steady, breathing audible. The next moment his light clattered to the deck, still active, and he was gone. No sound of struggle, no cry. Simply absent. "Contract formation!" Kelvin shouted, and we pulled tighter together, reducing our perimeter but intensifying our light concentration. We continued forward. The darkness grew more aggressive. I could see shapes forming at the edge of our light, humanoid outlines that moved with wrong geometry, limbs at angles that violated anatomy. They were not attacking yet, just observing, studying how we moved. where our light overlapped, where gaps existed in our illumination. Another scream behind us. We turned as a group, lights sweeping back. Rating Chen was being pulled backward by her own shadow. Her shadow had become three-dimensional, had gained substance, had grabbed her ankles and was dragging her away from the group. She clawed at the deck, her hands finding no purchase on the smooth metal, her face stretched in terror. Kelvin lunged for her, grabbed her arms, tried to pull her back. But the shadow was stronger. It yanked her out of his grip and into the darkness beyond our light. We heard her for another few seconds, screaming, begging, and then silence. We had lost 12 people by the time we reached engineering. The survivors were panicked, lights waving erratically, people bumping into each other in our desperate attempt to maintain illumination. When we finally crossed the threshold into engineering's main chamber, we found the auxiliary generators running at minimal output, just enough to power the emergency lumens in this section alone. Engineer Kyle went immediately to the control panels, his augmetic hands moving across the interfaces. Ven joined him, both of them working to diagnose why the main power systems had failed. I stood guard with the others, our lights pointed outward into the darkness that pressed against engineering's entrance. The power grid shows multiple simultaneous failures, Kale reported. Relays in 17 separate junctions, all opened at the same instant. That is not mechanically possible without coordinated sabotage or an external control signal. There is a third option, Ven said quietly. These entities understand electromagnetic systems well enough to manipulate them directly. They did not damage our power grid. They simply commanded it to stop functioning. Can you restore it? Kelvin asked. Ven and Kale exchanged a look, a communication that passed between tech priests without need for words. Finally, Ven nodded. Yes, but there is a complication. To restore full power, we must manually reset each failed junction. That requires physically traveling to 17 separate locations throughout the ship and cycling the relays. We cannot split up, I said. We have barely survived staying together. Then we travel as one group to all 17 locations, Ven replied. It will take approximately 6 hours, and we must do so in sections that will remain dark until power is restored. We had no choice. The alternative was to remain trapped in engineering while the Umbra claimed the rest of the ship, section by section, until even this small illuminated space was isolated and eventually breached. We would attempt the repair circuit. We left engineering as a group of 11. 19 had entered. 8 had been taken during our time there, pulled into the shadows that crept at the edges of our inadequate light. The life sign sensors, still functional in engineering, showed 43 crew members remaining somewhere on the ship. Most of those were likely holed up in the bridge or other lit sections, too terrified to move. The relay junctions were distributed throughout the vessel according to power distribution logic rather than accessibility. Some were in main corridors, others were in crawl spaces and service tunnels. Each required us to enter cramped, dark locations where our lights could barely function, and our movement was restricted. At Junction 7, located in a maintenance tunnel barely wide enough for one person at a time, we lost Kyle. He had crawled into the access shaft to reach the relay controls, while the rest of us held position at the tunnel entrance, shining our lights down the shaft as far as they would reach. We heard him working, the clank of tools on metal, his breathing echoing in the confined space. Then his light went out. We called to him. No response. Kelvin crawled into the shaft, his own light held before him. He made it 3 meters before retreating rapidly, his face drained of color. "It's full of them," he said. "The tunnel is packed with shadow forms, layered so thick I couldn't see through them." Kyle is gone, but the relay junction had been reset before he was taken. The sacrifice, if we could call it that, had achieved its purpose. We moved on. By Junction 12, we were 5. Ven, Kelvin, myself, and 2 ratings, whose names I'm ashamed to say I do not remember. The Umbra had refined their hunting method. They no longer simply pulled people into darkness. They were using our own lights against us. They would wait until someone's hand lumen battery began to fail, the beam growing dimmer. In that moment of reduced illumination, they would strike, pulling the victim away faster than the rest of us could react. Junction 14 was in the cargo bay, a vast space where our lights could barely reach the far bulkheads. The relay controls were mounted on the wall 50 meters from the entrance. We could see them clearly, illuminated by our beams. Between us and those controls was empty space, shadowed and waiting. Ven proposed a solution. We would link ourselves with cable, physically tethered together. If the Umbra tried to take one of us, the others could pull back, could rescue whoever was grabbed. It was a reasonable plan. It failed immediately. We made it 30 meters before the shadows rose from the deck, forming a wall of darkness that our lights could not penetrate. Behind that wall, something grabbed the rearmost rating and pulled. The cable went taut. We hauled back, trying to drag him free. The cable snapped. The rating's scream was brief. Kelvin made a command decision. Run. All of us, straight to the relay controls, maximum speed. Do not stop for anything. On his signal, we ran. I do not remember that run clearly. It was chaos and darkness, and the sensation of things brushing against me, cold touches that pulled at my clothes, at my hair, at the edges of my light. I remember Ven running beside me, his augmetic legs giving him mechanical endurance. I remember the relay controls getting closer, and I remember the second rating falling behind, his light tumbling as he went down. 3 of us reached the relay controls. Ven reset Junction 14, while Kelvin and I held our lights out, creating a perimeter. The shadows kept their distance, but I could see them accumulating, building in density, preparing for another assault. The remaining junctions were completed in a blur of terror and exhaustion. We lost Kelvin at Junction 16, pulled through a ventilation grate too small for his body, but apparently not too small for the shadows to drag him through. By the time Ven and I reached the final junction, we were the only ones left from the expedition. Junction 17 was located near engineering, a mercy that meant we were close to relative safety. Ven completed the reset. Throughout the ship, power began flowing again. Lumen-strips flickered to life. Systems came online. The Midnight Covenant returned to full illumination for the first time in 7 hours. The shadows retreated, not entirely, but noticeably. They withdrew to the darker corners, the spaces behind equipment, the narrow gaps between wall panels. With full power restored, the ship's normal lighting created an environment where the Umbra could not move freely. We had bought ourselves time. Ven and I returned to the bridge. Life sign sensors showed 31 remaining crew. We had lost 96 people in less than 8 hours. Captain Helmar, still alive and still attempting to maintain command, gathered the survivors. 31 people in a ship designed for 127. We stood in the bridge's full illumination and tried to formulate a plan that would allow us to survive whatever time remained before we reached a system with potential rescue. Mediki Sora, also among the survivors, reported that Rating Marsh, the first victim, had died during the power failure. His body showed no physical trauma. His heart had simply stopped, as if he had been drained of whatever animating force sustains human life. She had no medical explanation. Ven presented his analysis. The entities we face exist primarily in darkness, but can manifest briefly in illuminated areas. They feed on living beings, consuming not just flesh, but something else. Possibly the electromagnetic energy that biological systems generate. They are intelligent, capable of coordinated action and tactical adjustment. They learn from our responses and adapt their methods. Captain Helmar listened without interruption. When Ven finished, the captain asked the only question that mattered. "How do we kill them? We cannot," Ven replied. "Not with any weapons or tools available to us. They are not material beings in the conventional sense, but we can create conditions that limit their activity. We maintain maximum illumination throughout the ship. We seal sections we do not need. We consolidate our presence in easily defended, well-lit areas. And we make for the nearest Imperial outpost at maximum possible speed." "How long until we reach the nearest port?" Kelvin asked. Helmar checked the navigation plots. 8 days at current velocity." We looked at each other, performing the same grim calculation. 31 people. 8 days. The Umbra had claimed 96 crew in 8 hours. Even if we maintained illumination, even if we defended ourselves perfectly, the mathematics did not favor survival. We organized our remaining crew into 3 shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake, always watching, always maintaining the lights. We moved all personnel to the bridge and the adjoining command sections, sealing every other part of the ship. We set every lumen strip to maximum output, draining power reserves, but creating illumination intense enough to eliminate nearly all shadows. For 3 days, this strategy worked. We lost no additional crew. The Umbra remained in the sealed sections, apparently unable or unwilling to enter areas with such aggressive lighting. We began to hope that we might survive. On the 4th day, the lights began to dim. Not fail entirely, but gradually lose intensity. Ven discovered the problem immediately. The Umbra had learned to drain power directly from the lumen strips themselves, feeding on the electrical current, reducing the available energy. Our lights were still functioning, but each hour they grew a fraction dimmer, and as they dimmed, the shadows crept back. We implemented rationing. Lights were kept at maximum only in the areas where people were actively present. Other sections were allowed to dim to half power, then quarter power, then darkness. We retreated section by section, contracting our defended area as the Umbra expanded theirs. By day 6, we held only the bridge. 27 of us, crowded into a space designed for a watch crew of 8. 4 more had been taken when they attempted to retrieve supplies from sections that had dimmed too much. We had food and water for perhaps 3 more days. We had no sleep because closing our eyes in the presence of the shadows invited them closer. We were breaking down, physically and psychologically, waiting for either rescue or death. On day 7, Raiding Voss went mad. He began screaming that the shadows were inside him, that they had been feeding on him for days, that he could feel them eating his memories. He grabbed a pry bar and attacked the main lumen strips, trying to smash them, trying to bring darkness. Kelvin had to kill him. We dumped his body in the corridor outside the bridge, and the shadows took it within minutes. I do not remember day 8 clearly. I know we maintained our position. I know we continued to watch the sensors, tracking our approach to the nearest inhabited system. I know that the Umbra were now visible, even in the bridge's full light. Thin shapes that slid across the bulkheads, patient and certain. On the morning of day 9, our proximity alarms detected a vessel. an Imperial patrol cutter responding to our distress beacon. They hailed us, requested status report, confirmed they would match velocity, and prepare for emergency docking. We had survived. 23 of us. Less than a fifth of our original crew. The patrol cutter Righteous Duty sent over a boarding team in full void armor, equipped with military-grade lumens and weapons primed for threat response. They found us huddled in the bridge, our lights at minimum power, the shadows pressing against us from every direction. The rescue team's arrival, with their powerful illumination, drove the Umbra back into the sealed sections. We were evacuated immediately. No attempt was made to salvage the Midnight Covenant or investigate the Umbra presence. The boarding team simply extracted us, sealed the hatches behind them, and withdrew to their vessel. As soon as we were clear, the cutter fired on our ship, breaching the hull in multiple locations, exposing the interior to void. I watched through a viewport as the Midnight Covenant depressurized and died. I do not know if the Umbra died with it, or if they simply retreated to whatever dimension they truly inhabit, waiting for the next ship, the next crew, the next opportunity to hunt. The patrol cutter's captain, a woman named Severine, debriefed us individually. She was thorough and professional, recording our accounts with the careful precision of someone who would need to justify her decision to destroy an entire cargo vessel. When she interviewed me, she asked one question that the others had not. Did they speak to you? Any of you? Did they communicate in any way other than violence? I thought about the moment in Hold 23, when the shadow had opened, and I had glimpsed the ship as the Umbra saw it. That had been communication, in a sense. They had shown me their reality, the truth that humans navigate through their domain every time we travel the void, that our lights and our machines are intrusions into spaces that belong to older, stranger things. No, I lied. They just hunted us. Severine nodded and made a notation on her data slate. She did not believe me, I think, but she did not press the question. Of the 23 survivors, 6 died within a week of rescue. No physical cause could be determined. They simply faded, as if something essential had been taken from them, and their bodies were only just realizing it. Mediki Sora was among those 6. In her final moments, she told me she could still see them, the Umbra, waiting in the corners of her vision. She died with her eyes open, staring at something the rest of us could not see. The remaining 17 were dispersed across multiple assignments, separated by inquisitorial order. I do not know where the others ended up. I was assigned to a listening post in the Halo Stars, a solitary position monitoring long-range Vox traffic. I have been here for 2 years. The official record lists the Midnight Covenant as lost to catastrophic systems failure during transit through unstable warp currents. No mention of the Umbra. No acknowledgement of the 96 crew who were consumed. The ship was simply marked as destroyed, its tithe run reassigned to another vessel. This is standard procedure, I have learned. The Imperium maintains extensive records of similar incidents, ships that went dark, crews that disappeared, encounters with entities that exist in the spaces between human understanding. These records are sealed, accessible only to those with appropriate clearance and need to know. The knowledge is contained because the alternative, admitting that the void between stars is populated by things that hunt us, would undermine the mechanisms that keep humanity expanding across the galaxy. I write this account knowing it will likely be seized and classified. I write it anyway because the survivors deserve documentation, because their deaths meant something, because someone should acknowledge what they faced. We traveled through darkness thinking light would save us. We learned that light is only permission to see what was always there, The Umbra are real. They exist in the shadows of every voidship, every station, every structure humans have built in space. Most of the time, they are content to remain passive, existing alongside us without interaction. But sometimes, for reasons we do not understand, they become active. They hunt, and when they do, there is no defense except to run, to reach light and safety before they finish feeding. I do not sleep well. When I close my eyes, I see that opening in the shadow, that glimpse into their reality. I see the Midnight Covenant as a bright wound in their domain, our lights and our presence a painful intrusion they methodically erased. I understand now that we were never the hunters in that encounter. We were always prey. Every ship that travels the void carries shadows. Most crews never notice them, never see them move, never watch them open and reveal what lies beneath. Those crews are fortunate. They complete their voyages in ignorance of what accompanies them, what watches from the dark corners, what waits for the moment when the lights fail and the hunt can begin. I am no longer fortunate. I know what travels with us, and I know that light, for all its comfort and safety, is only a temporary condition. Darkness is the natural state. We are the intrusion, the aberration, the bright things moving through a universe that belongs to shadows. Every night at this listening post, I keep every lumen burning. I do not allow a single shadow to form, and I watch, always watch, because I know what happens when you stop watching. They do not forget. They do not forgive. They simply wait, patient as the void itself, for the inevitable moment when the lights go dark and the hunt resumes. That is what it is like to be hunted by living shadows. Not a quick death or a glorious battle. Just the slow recognition that you are being erased, piece by piece, by something that exists in the spaces you thought were empty. And the final understanding that you were never really safe, that the light was always just a delay, and that in the end, the darkness claims everything.